The effect of the myth on freedom advocates. Government itself does no harm because it is a fictional entity. But the belief in government, the notion that some people actually have the moral right to rule over others, has caused immeasurable pain and suffering, injustice and oppression, enslavement and death. The fundamental problem does not reside in any set of buildings or any group of politicians or any gang of soldiers or enforcers. The fundamental problem is not an organization that can be voted out or overthrown or reformed. The fundamental problem is the belief itself, the delusion, superstition, and myth of authority, which resides in the minds of several billion human beings, including those who have suffered the most because of that belief. Ironically, the belief in authority dramatically affects the perception and actions even of those who are actively fighting against a particular regime. The superstition drastically alters and limits the ways in which dissenters fight oppression and renders nearly all their efforts impotent. Furthermore, on the fair occasion that a particular tyrant is toppled, one form of oppression is always replaced by another, often one that is even worse than the prior one. Instead of fighting against a non-existent beast, what freedom fighters need to do is recognize that it is not real, that it does not exist, that it cannot exist, and then act accordingly. Of course, if only a few people overcome the superstition, they will likely be ridiculed, condemned, attacked in prison, or murdered by those who are still firm believers in the myth. But when even a significant minority of people outgrow the superstition and change their behavior accordingly, the world will change drastically. When the people actually want true freedom, they will achieve it without the need for any election or revolution. The trouble is, almost no one actually wants humanity to be free, and almost no one opposes oppression in principle. The effects of the myth of authority remain intact even in the minds of most people who consider themselves to be rebels, nonconformists, and free thinkers. During their teenage years, many people go through a period of apparent rebelliousness, which consists mostly of doing whatever those in authority tell them not to do, engaging in smoking, sexual promiscuity, drug use, wearing different clothes or hairstyles, getting tattoos or body piercings, and so on. As such, their actions are still controlled, albeit in a backward way, but the myth of authority by the myth of authority. Instead of obeying for the sake of obeying, they disobey for the sake of disobeying, but still show no signs of being able to think for themselves. They behave like angry children instead of complacent children, but still do not behave like adults. And in most cases, their natural desire to break the chains of authority does not last long. They outgrow their anti-authoritarian tendencies and gradually transform back into model citizens, i.e. obedient subjects. For example, the new supposedly radical anti-authoritarian hippies of the 1960s more or less became the new government in the United States with the presidency of Bill Clinton. Even the peaceniks whose mantra was, "Live and let live," when given the opportunity to become the new authority, chose to forcibly meddle with the lives of others as much as or more than their predecessors did, including via military conquest. Likewise, those in Generation X, the MTV crowd, and so on, have always focused their efforts on putting people who agree with them into power instead of working to actually achieve freedom. There's a fundamental difference between having complaints about a particular ruling class and recognizing and opposing the insanity of authority in principle. In short, all of the various societal manifestations of so-called rebelliousness and nonconformity, almost none have actually escaped the myth of authority. Instead, they have merely attempted to make a new authority, a new ruling class, a new government, a new centralized machine of coercion through which they could forcibly subjugate and control their neighbors. In short, nearly all so-called rebels are phonies who pretend to be resisting the man, but who really just want to be the man. And this should be expected. If one starts with the assumption that there should be and must be an authority, and that a government exerting control over a population is a legitimate situation, why would anyone not want to be the one in charge? Each person, by definition, wants the world to be the way he thinks it should be, and what better way could a person accomplish this by becoming king? If someone accepts the notion that authoritarian power is valid, why would he not want it to be used to try to create the world he wants to be in? This is why the only people who truly advocate freedom in principle are anarchists and voluntarists. People who understand that forcibly dominating others is not legitimate even when it's called law, and even when it's done in the name of the people or the common good. There's a big difference between striving for a new, wiser, nobler master and striving for a world of equals where there are no masters and no slaves. Likewise, there is a big difference between a slave who believes in the principle of freedom and a slave whose ultimate goal is to become the new master. And this is true even if that slave truly intends to be a kind and generous master. Even those who advocate a relatively limited government, type of government who are Bennigan type of government, are advocating against freedom. As long as the people believe in the myth of authority, every downfall of one tyrant will be followed by the creation and growth of a new tyrant. History is replete with examples such as Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who portrayed themselves as freedom fighters just long enough to become the new oppressors. They were no doubt quite genuine in their vehement opposition to the oppressions which they and their friends suffered from, but they were not opposed to authoritarian oppression in principle, as clearly demonstrated by their behavior once they obtained power themselves. This pattern has been repeated over and over again throughout history, with the resentment of one tyrannical regime becoming the seed of the next tyrannical regime. Even Hitler's rise to power was due in large part to anger at the perceived injustices and oppressions inflicted upon Germany via the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, as long as rebels suffer from the superstition of authority, their first priority, once they have overthrown one government, will be to set up a new one. So, even acts of great bravery and heroism among those who still believe in government have accomplished little more than replacing one tyrant with another. Many have been able to recognize and oppose specific acts of tyranny by specific regimes, but very few have recognized that the underlying problem is not the one who sits on the throne. The problem is that there is a throne to sit on. The same failure to recognize the real problem occurs in a more mundane, relatively peaceful reform as well. In the US, for example, a large portion of the population is perfectly able to see the injustices resulting from the war on drugs, global warmongering, and other violations of civil rights committed by Republican tyrants. However, not recognizing the belief in authority as the real problem, the solution proposed by those who recognize such injustice is to give the reins of government to Democrat tyrants instead. Meanwhile, another large portion of the population is perfectly able to see the injustices resulting from heavy taxation, government micromanaging of wealth, redistribution schemes, citizen disarmament, gun control, etc., but do not recognize the belief in authority as the real problem. The solution proposed by those who recognize such injustices is to give the reins of government back to the Republican tyrants. And so after decade, the machine of oppression changes hands while individual freedom in all aspects of life continue to dwindle. And still, all that most Americans can even contemplate as the solution is yet another election or another political party or another lobbying effort in the hope of begging the ruling class to be more wise or benevolent. Some people seeing the disaster caused by the two-party system blame extremism for the negative effects of government. They surmise that if people would only support a form of coercive control somewhere between the far left and the far right, things would improve. Such people claim to be independent, open-minded, and moderate. But in reality, they are merely general advocates of oppression instead of being advocates for a particular form of oppression. The left and right are merely two masks which one ruling class wears, and making a new mask, which is a compromise between the other two, will have no effect whatsoever upon the nature of the beast or the destruction it causes. Taking a position halfway between left-wing and right-wing tyranny, tyranny does not result in freedom. It results in bipartisan tyranny. Among those who vote, Democrat or Republican, or for any other party, no one recognizes the underlying problem, and as a result, no one ever gets any closer to a solution. They remain slaves because their thoughts and discussions are limited to the pointless question of who should be their master. They never consider, and dare not allow themselves to consider, the possibility that they should have no master at all. As a result, they focus entirely on political action of one kind or another, but the foundation of all political action is the belief in authority, which is the problem itself, so the efforts of statists are always, and always will be, doomed to fail. Unfortunately, this is also true of the less mainstream, supposedly more pro-freedom political movements, including constitutionalists, the Libertarian Party, and others. As long as they think and act within the confines of government games, their efforts are not completely incapable of are not only completely incapable of solving the problem, but actually aggravate the problem by inadvertently legitimizing the system of domination and subjugation which wears the label of government.